September 12, 1943. High in the Apennine Mountains of central Italy, a four-story hotel sits perched on a rocky plateau 2,100 meters above sea level. Inside one of its rooms, a man sits alone. His name is Benito Mussolini, and somewhere in the sky above, a rescue is about to unfold that will rely on a machine so fragile, so underpowered, so seemingly unsuited to the task ahead that nobody believes it can work. The Fieseler Fi 156 Storch. This is the story of how an aircraft built to whisper became history's most unlikely hero. For more than 20 years, Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy with absolute authority. He was the Duce, the infallible leader, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. But by the summer of 1943, his world was collapsing. The Allies had invaded Sicily, German generals were losing confidence, and the Italian people were exhausted. On the 25th of July, the fascist Grand Council voted him out of power. The king had him arrested, and within hours, Mussolini found himself a prisoner in his own country, moved from location to location, hidden away where German intelligence could not reach him. Hitler watched this unfold with growing alarm. His closest ally was now in enemy hands. And if Italy surrendered to the Allies, as Hitler feared it would, Mussolini might be paraded before the world, humiliated, perhaps even executed. The Führer had to act. On the 8th of September, Hitler gave the order, find Mussolini and bring him back, by any means necessary. What followed was one of World War II's most daring operations. It would require paratroopers landing on a mountain fortress. It would require ground forces fighting their way up impossible terrain. But most crucially, it would require an aircraft to do something no aircraft should be able to do: land on a rocky slope, collect a prisoner, and take off again from an understated altitude where the air itself was thin and unforgiving. This is the tale of Operation Oak. But, more importantly, itis the tale of the Storch, the little plane that Germany didn't know it needed. The Fieseler Fi 156 was born from a simple concept. Germany needed a liaison aircraft. Something small, slow, and maneuverable. Something that could land and take off from virtually anywhere. It was not built for combat. It carried no weapons. It was not meant to be brave. It was designed to be efficient. The aircraft had an unusual high wing configuration and fixed landing gear. Its fuselage was welded steel tube covered with fabric. To look at it was to understand its purpose. This was a workhorse, a practical tool, not a weapon of war. Booty had qualities that no one anticipated when designing it. The Storch could land in less than 80 meters. It could take off in even less. Its cruising speed was barely 130 kilometers per hour. At high altitude, where oxygen was thin and engines struggled, a conventional aircraft might stall and fall from the sky. But Storch, with its powerful wing and incredible slowness, could coax itself higher and higher. It was, in a word, impossible to kill. Military pilots called it the grasshopper, a small insect that could hop anywhere, land anywhere, survive anywhere. By 1943, more than 800 of them existed in the Luftwaffe inventory, but none of them had ever been asked to do what was about to be demanded. The operation itself was enormous in scope. Paratroopers would descend on the Gran Sasso Hotel. Ground forces would fight their way up from below. German commandos would storm the Buse building. The coordination had to be perfect. The timing had to be exact. But the planners faced a problem. After the gliders landed, after the Italians surrendered, They still needed to get Mussolini out. The roads were unsafe. Partisan activity was widespread. The only solution was to fly him out. But how? The plateau was too small for a regular transport aircraft to land. The air was too thin at that altitude for heavy aircraft to take off with a full load. And then someone remembered the Storch, the little plane that could land on a postage stamp. Could it land on a rocky mountaintop? Could it take off again at over 2,000 meters with a passenger aboard? Nobody knew. Butti was the only option they had. On the morning of the 12th of September, at the Luftwaffe airfield near Rome, a pilot named Heinrich Gerlach prepared a single Fi 156 for what might be a suicide mission. He was a skilled pilot. He knew the aircraft well. He also knew that what was being asked of him was at the very edge of possibility. The aircraft had been stripped down to minimum weight. Every unnecessary kilogram had been removed. Even the radio had been taken out to save weight. Gerlach checked the engine. He reviewed the specifications. The air temperature at 2,100 meters would be cold. The air would be thin. The aircraft's engines would struggle, but they would have to work. Meanwhile, 150 kilometers away, at the Hotel Campo Imperator, everything was falling apart for the Italians. German gliders were landing. Paratroopers were pouring out of the sky. An SS officer named Otto Skorzeny was leading the assault, and the Italian guards, confused, demoralized, uncertain of their loyalties after Italy's surrender just days before, were laying down their arms without a shot. Within minutes, the hotel was secured. Mussolini was found in his room. He was brought downstairs. And there, in the lobby of the hotel, standing, with German soldiers surrounding him, the old dictator realized what had happened. Hitler had sent for him. His friend Adolf Hitler had not abandoned him. But there was a problem. The plateau where the Storch needed to land was rocky. It was rough. It was covered with boulders the size of a man. There was no runway. There was no prepared surface. There was only terrain that looked like it belonged on a mountain, not at an airfield. Italian soldiers began moving the larger rocks away. They cleared what space they could. It was perhaps 300 meters of usable ground. Not much, barely enough. The Storch would have to land in that space, brake hard, pick up its passenger, and take off again before the aircraft rolled off the edge of the plateau or into a boulder field. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the sound of aircraft engines appeared over the mountains. The Storch came in low, its pilot visible in the open cockpit, his face concentrated, his hands steady on the controls. The aircraft touched down hard. Its landing gear absorbed the impact. Skorzeny helped Mussolini into the passenger seat. A German officer climbed in beside him. The pilot, Gerlach, pushed the throttles forward. The engine roared. The Storch began to roll across the rocky ground. What happened next was almost catastrophic. The aircraft, heavily loaded, began to pick up speed toward the edge of the plateau. Below was 1,000 meters of open air. The ground fell away beneath the Storch's wheels. For a moment, nobody knew if the aircraft would climb or fall. The engine was screaming. The airspeed indicator was climbing slowly, agonizingly slowly. And then, at the very last moment, the little aircraft's nose rose. The wheels left the ground. It was airborne. Butit was barely climbing. The thin air was starving the engine of oxygen. The Storch was flying, but just barely. Flying more like a grasshopper jumping than a proper aircraft. It was dropping as much as it was climbing. Mountains surrounded it on all sides. One stall, one loss of airspeed, and it would spiral into a peak. Gerlach kept the nose up. He kept the throttles at maximum. He coaxed the struggling little aircraft higher by sheer force of will and skilled hands on the controls. Minutes passed. The Storch climbed meter by meter, 1,000 meters, 1,200, 1,500. The aircraft was shaking. It was struggling. The engine was crying out. Bouti kept flying. It kept climbing. And finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity, the Storch crossed a mountain ridge and began to descend slightly as it moved toward lower altitude. It was going to make it. The impossible had happened. A tiny, fragile aircraft had taken off from an impossible altitude with a passenger that changed the course of history. By nightfall, Mussolini was in Vienna. By the next day, he was in East Prussia shaking hands with Hitler. The photographs and newsreel footage were immediately circulated throughout the Reich. Here was proof that Germany could still pull off the impossible. The Storch had done it. The little plane had snatched Mussolini off a mountain and delivered him to safety. But here is what is remarkable. After that one incredible flight, the Storch's role in the operation was over. It returned to normal duties. Other Storch flew reconnaissance missions. They carried supplies. They evacuated wounded. By the end of the war, more than 1,000 had been built. But none would ever be asked to do what that single aircraft had accomplished on the 12th of September, 1943. The Storch was not a fighter. It carried no weapons. It could not defend itself. It had no armor plating. A single rifle bullet could bring it down. Yet it had achieved something that entire squadrons of fighter aircraft could not. It had completed an impossible mission. It had proven that sometimes the most important characteristic of a military aircraft is not speed, firepower, but the simple ability to be where others cannot go. In the months that followed, the Storch continued to serve. It landed on frozen lakes in Russia. It flew through mountain passes in the Balkans. It operated from rough strips in North Africa. German pilots loved the aircraft because they trusted it, and the aircraft repaid that trust time, and again by delivering them safely to places where no other aircraft could go. But the Storch was never given credit for Operation Oak. The headlines went to the paratroopers. The glory went to Skorzeny and his commandos. The little aircraft that had made the entire operation possible was barely mentioned. It was as if the plane was too humble, too unglamorous, to deserve recognition, which is perhaps fitting. The Storch was not built for glory. It was built to work, to serve, to be reliable when everything else failed. And that is what it did on a cold September afternoon, at an altitude where the air itself seemed too thin to support flight. A tiny plane, designed to whisper, became history's most unlikely hero. It snatched a dictator off a mountain and delivered him to safety, not through power or speed, but through the simple, unstoppable virtue of being able to do what everyone else said was impossible. The Storch remained in service with the Luftwaffe until the very end of the war. German pilots continued to rely on it, continued to trust it, because they had learned the most important lesson a military pilot can learn. Sometimes the aircraft that saves your life is not the one with the most guns, or the most armor, or the most speed. It is the one that can land when nothing else can land. The one that can take off when nothing else can take off. The one that whispers when others must scream. In 1945, as Germany collapsed, the last Storch were destroyed or captured. The aircraft that had accomplished so much was scattered across the wreckage of a defeated nation. Budit's legend lived on. Pilots in every air force began to understand that the most valuable aircraft are sometimes the smallest, the slowest, the ones that can go anywhere and do anything, because they refuse to be bound by the limitations everyone else accepts as inevitable. The tiny plane that snatched Mussolini off a mountain became a symbol of something larger. The power of innovation born from necessity. The Storch was not the fastest aircraft in the German arsenal. It was not the most powerful, but it was, in the end, more useful than all the fighters and bombers combined. It proved that in war, as in life, sometimes the smallest solutions are the most elegant, the most reliable, the most extraordinary. That is the story of the Fieseler Fi 156 Storch, the grasshopper that became an eagle, the liaison plane that changed history, and the little aircraft that, on one impossible afternoon, showed the world what it meant to be truly unstoppable. Did you know that the Storch was so successful that other nations immediately began copying its design? The Japanese built their own version. The Allies captured examples and flew them as well. In fact, one captured Storch was flown by the Allies throughout the latter part of the Prast War. The aircraft had proven something that military strategists still debate today. That dud, dud. Sometimes, in the complex machinery of modern warfare, the most important capability is not raw power, but flexibility, versatility, the ability to do the unexpected. If you found this story of the Storch and its incredible mission fascinating, subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We will be exploring the story of the Nazi helicopter nobody remembers, the Fa-223, an aircraft so advanced, so ahead of its time, that it almost changed the war. Next time on this channel. Thanks for watching.